The wind rolled softly across the golden sands of the Nile Valley, whispering over ancient stones and forgotten tombs. Somewhere in the stillness of Egypt's sunburnt horizon, where silence clings to the walls of time like dust, the story of the pharaohs begins. Not the story told in textbooks, but the quieter, stranger one. The disturbing one. The one that sleep often stirs, but history forgets. You are about to slip into that other world now. A slower world. A dream soaked in incense, stone, and shadows. Imagine lying in a cool, dark room carved deep into the rock, somewhere beneath the floor of a towering temple. Outside, priests chant to a sun god who doesn't answer. Inside, a young servant, no older than 14, is carrying a golden bowl filled with scented oil. His hands tremble. He's not sure if it's from the weight of the bowl or the weight of being this close to the Pharaoh, the living god. One mistake and his life could be over. No one would ask questions. No one would speak his name again. That was how things were here. Life in ancient Egypt, especially around the pharaohs, was not simply grand or glorious. It was controlled, predictable in its routine, yet always heavy with expectation. To the outside world, these kings and queens were divine. They wore gold masks and claimed to rule by the will of the gods. But behind the high palace walls and inside their private chambers, things were often far more complicated and far more unsettling. The palace was always quiet in a strange way. Not the kind of quiet you hear when the world is asleep, but the kind you feel when no one dares to speak. Servants moved like shadows, eyes low, footsteps soft. Everyone knew that the Pharaoh, for all their divine image, could be terrifying. They were raised in isolation, bathed in flattery, and taught from a young age that they were not human like everyone else. That kind of thinking changes a person. It creates rulers who don't understand fear, or maybe only understand it too well, and use it to control everyone around them. Each day began before the sun, with servants lighting lamps and preparing the sacred rituals. The Pharaoh could not rise without the correct blessings. They could not eat without food being blessed by temple priests. They could not even dress without ceremony. Even the act of breathing seemed like something rehearsed, watched, and judged. But underneath all this ritual was something raw and human. Some pharaohs felt trapped by their role. Others became obsessed with it. One young pharaoh, whose name has been mostly lost to time, was said to have refused to speak for an entire year. Some say he believed the gods would only hear him if he spoke at night, in secret. Others claim he simply didn't trust anyone around him. He would sit in a grand chamber, silent and alone, while the entire court waited outside. They didn't know if he was praying or plotting. Even the high priest was afraid to knock. Every servant was warned not to look directly at him. Yet every morning, when the sun rose, he would appear in full regalia, smiling softly as if none of it had happened. But that was how life worked inside the palace. What happened at night didn't matter, as long as the day looked perfect. Truth was a slippery thing. Power was even slipperier. The women of the court lived under their own set of strange rules. Queen consorts, princesses, concubines, all lived in the harem, a place far removed from public life. Outsiders imagined luxury, perfumes, jewelry, silk, but the reality was often different. The harem was quiet, but not peaceful. It was tense, competitive. The higher your status, the closer you were to danger. A queen who displeased the pharaoh might vanish. A concubine who gave birth to a royal child might find herself suddenly promoted or suddenly poisoned. And through it all, gossip flowed like the Nile, smooth, constant, and able to drown anyone who didn't watch their step. Children born to pharaohs were raised to believe they were special, divine, different, but many of them lived in deep fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of being replaced, fear of growing up in a world where no one ever told them the truth. Some were kept away from public life entirely, hidden in secret chambers within the palace until they were old enough or useful enough to be shown to the court. And some never made it that far. Even the priests, who seemed so powerful, walked carefully. They were the keepers of rituals, the whisperers to the gods, and yet they too were watched. A priest who failed in a ceremony might be dismissed quietly. Or worse, never seen again. No one questioned the pharaoh, not out loud. But beneath the surface, everyone was questioning. Even the pharaohs sometimes questioned themselves. At night, the palace would sink into a strange, eerie stillness. The lamps would flicker and fade. The statues of gods would watch from their altars. Somewhere, a jackal would howl. And in those hours, strange things would happen. Some said the pharaohs wandered the halls in silence, speaking to spirits. Others believed certain rooms in the palace were never meant to be entered, even by royalty. There were doors that stayed sealed for generations. Chambers with no windows. And always the sense that something was watching. There were rumors, always rumors, of curses written in hidden scrolls, of royal advisors who knew too much and disappeared, of chambers buried beneath the palace where failed heirs were locked away, of mirrors that showed visions of the future. Some of these stories might have been exaggerations, but in a place where gods and rulers were one and the same, it became hard to tell where truth ended and myth began. The tombs were perhaps the most telling part of all. Built not only to honor the dead, but to prepare for eternity. They were filled with spells, statues, and treasures. But they were also filled with fear. Fear of judgment. Fear of being forgotten. Fear of waking up in the afterlife without a name or a heart to weigh. For all their power, pharaohs feared death deeply. And they feared what came after even more. One pharaoh, whose tomb remains hidden to this day, was said to have built a secret burial chamber so far beneath the earth that no one could find it, not even his own family. He believed that even in death, he would be hunted, and so he surrounded his final resting place with traps, riddles, and false passages. His name has nearly vanished from history, but his fear lingers, like the echo of a whisper inside a dark hallway. So this is where we begin, not with grand monuments or golden thrones, but with a soft, strange quiet, with the things history books don't always tell you, with the uneasy truth that even the most powerful people in the ancient world live surrounded by fear, silence, and mystery. As we move deeper into their lives, through palace corridors, temple rituals, and tombs hidden beneath the sand, you'll begin to see the pharaohs not just as rulers, but as people. People with secrets. People shaped by rituals, by belief, by paranoia. And maybe people not so different from us after all. But before we go any further, there's something you should know. Not all of these stories end peacefully. Some disappear mid-sentence. Some names are erased from stone as if they never existed. Some doors, once opened, cannot be shut again. So if you're ready, close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Let the sand cover your footsteps. Let the past unfold like a quiet dream. Because the story of the pharaohs is just beginning, and already something stirs behind the throne. By the time the first rays of morning touched the white limestone of the palace walls, life inside had already been moving for hours. The high priest had completed his first prayers. The palace servants had polished the golden bowls, straightened the reed mats, and arranged the jars of wine and honey on the table. But no one had seen the pharaoh. That was not unusual. The pharaoh's presence was not required in the early hours, not by tradition, at least. But still, everyone waited. The tension crept through the halls like incense smoke, quiet and constant. People did not wait for the pharaoh simply because they wanted to. They waited because their lives depended on it. A young scribe, no more than 16, stood at the edge of the room with a scroll clutched in his hands. He had practiced his report all night. It was nothing important, just updates from a village that had experienced flooding along the Nile. Still, his hands were sweaty, his throat dry. If the pharaoh was in a bad mood, the boy could be dismissed before speaking a word. Or worse, punishment wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was silence, isolation, erasure. Being ignored was often more frightening than being struck. The walls of the great hall were covered in scenes of glory. Pharaohs slaying lions, receiving gifts from gods, towering over prisoners in chains. But these painted figures didn't smile. Their eyes stared straight ahead, eternal and empty. It reminded people where they stood. It reminded them that the pharaoh was not just a man or a woman, but a symbol. something more than human. And yet, the truth was messy. Some pharaohs had been born weak, sick. Some had died young, too young to be remembered with honor. Others had ruled for decades, but never understood the land or the people they governed. They were kept insulated, hidden behind advisors and temple officials who fed them lies. And occasionally, behind those polished walls, they broke down. One story, whispered but never written, spoke of a pharaoh who refused to leave his bed for months. He believed that death waited for him just outside his chamber door, wearing the face of his dead brother. He had the walls painted black and demanded that no light enter the room. Only one servant was allowed in, to bring food and remove waste. When that servant disappeared one night, no one searched for him. A new one was chosen, and the rituals continued. Because in Egypt, the show must go on. But even more disturbing were the rituals surrounding death itself. You'd think that in a place so obsessed with the afterlife, the process of preparing a pharaoh for burial would be peaceful. It was not. The embalmers were chosen carefully. Many of them were prisoners or outsiders, people who would not be missed. They were brought into hidden chambers, blindfolded, and forced to work in silence. They removed organs, stuffed the body with oils and resins, and sewed the skin shut. The heart, once believed to hold the soul, was weighed by priests in sacred ceremony. But before that, it was often hidden, placed in tiny gold boxes or swallowed by fire to keep it safe. After the body was prepared, it was taken, sometimes in secret, always with ceremony, to its tomb. And while the public believed the pharaoh would now rest in peace, the truth was that the tomb was never safe. Grave robbing was not just a threat, it was expected. That's why the most powerful pharaohs built decoys, false doors, empty chambers, even trap-filled corridors to confuse thieves. But none of it worked forever. Greed finds its way, even through stone. And some of the tombs we now admire were likely already emptied long before archaeologists ever found them. Still, inside the tombs, we find strange things. Writings not meant for public eyes. Symbols scratched into stone after the paint had dried. Scenes that don't match the official stories, like a pharaoh weeping, or alone, or reaching toward a god who doesn't answer. These small, hidden details tell us more about their inner lives than any grand monument ever could. They show us fear, doubt, regret. Even more telling were the dreams. Pharaohs believed dreams were messages from beyond, warnings or blessings sent by gods or ancestors. That's why they kept dream interpreters close. Old men and women who had learned to read the language of sleep. If a pharaoh dreamed of drowning, a priest might recommend a ritual cleansing. If they dreamed of flying, it could be a sign of impending death or greatness. One story tells of a queen who dreamed the Nile turned red. The priests declared it a bad omen. That same year, the river flooded beyond its banks, destroying thousands of homes. Many whispered that the queen had cursed the land by dreaming too much. Some claimed her dreams had summoned the flood. Either way, she was gone by the next season. No public mourning. No tomb discovered. Her name erased. Names were everything in ancient Egypt. To have a name was to live forever. That's why the worst punishment was not death, but removal. Carving a name off a monument. Scraping it from temple walls. Erasing it from scrolls. When someone's name was removed, they were condemned to be forgotten. No soul. No afterlife, just silence. And yet, some names survive, not because they were remembered with love, but because they were feared. Like the pharaoh who ordered his entire family buried alive to prevent them from threatening his throne. Or the one who forced slaves to build a new palace every 5 years, only to abandon it once complete. Some believe these stories were exaggerated. Others believe the truth was far worse. Power isolates. It blinds. And in the long hallways of the palace, filled with flickering torchlight and hushed voices, the line between divine and monstrous often blurred. Still, not every pharaoh was cruel. Some tried to reform the system. One young ruler, barely out of childhood, opened the palace gates and invited farmers to speak with him directly. He abolished certain taxes and promised fair treatment for all. But such peace didn't last. His own advisors betrayed him within a year. Poisoned. his reforms reversed, his statues defaced, his tomb unmarked. And this is the part of the story that history often skips, the part where idealism dies quietly and ambition takes its place, where human hearts, even royal ones, are crushed beneath the weight of tradition and fear. The palace itself played a role in all of this. It was not just a home, but a machine, a place designed to trap its inhabitants in rituals, silence, and control. Every room had meaning. Every wall had ears. You could not speak freely. You could not love freely. Even laughter was dangerous if done in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were rooms that were only entered once a year, hallways where only certain feet were allowed to tread. And there were the secret chambers, rooms known only to a few, used for purposes no one ever wrote down. It is in one of these secret chambers, hidden deep within the heart of the palace, that our story now turns. A room without windows, with walls covered not in gold, but in ash. A room that few ever entered. A room where a single oil lamp still burns, though no servant claims to tend it. And inside this room sits a figure, hooded, still, watching, waiting. Waiting for what? That is the question that haunts the palace even now, centuries later. A question no one has dared answer. Because some say that room was built not for the pharaohs, but for something older, something even the gods feared, something not written in scrolls or carved in stone. But that, of course, is another story, and it's waiting just around the corner. The walls of that hidden chamber were unlike any other in the palace. While most royal rooms were decorated with scenes of conquest, offerings to gods, and orderly processions of scribes and priests, this room was plain. Its surface rough and uneven, as if carved in a hurry or intentionally left unfinished. No inscriptions, no painted prayers, just deep, quiet stone that swallowed sound and gave nothing back. People didn't talk about this place openly, not even the palace architects who claimed to have designed every hallway and garden. When a room came up in whispers, it was only referred to as the Hollow Room. The figure inside it was said to never speak. He, or she, or perhaps neither, had been there longer than anyone could remember. Some claimed it was an ancient priest, chosen at birth and sealed into the room as part of a sacred vow. Others whispered it was not a person at all, but a spirit bound to the palace, part of a forgotten ritual older than even the gods of the Nile. The pharaohs knew of the room, all of them, but few dared to visit. And when they did, it was always alone. A story passed down through generations of temple workers told of one pharaoh who entered the Hollow Room just before sunrise. He was young, newly crowned, barely old enough to command a court. But he had dreams, vivid, disturbing ones, that refused to fade when he opened his eyes. He believed the answers to his questions lay in that room. The priests warned him against it. They reminded him that not all knowledge was meant for the living. But he went anyway. The guard were told to wait outside. No one else was permitted near. He was inside for only a few minutes. When he emerged, his eyes were hollow, wide, like someone who had seen the gods and been judged. He didn't speak for days. When he finally did, he ordered all temple rituals to be rewritten. He reversed sacred laws that had stood for centuries. Some believed he had gone mad. Others believed he had seen something that made him clearer than anyone else. Whatever the truth, he ruled with a strange calm from then on, a calm that unsettled everyone around him. That was the way it went, over and over again. Pharaohs who rose quickly fell suddenly. Those who ruled for years often vanished from history in the blink of a generation. The names scratched out, their monuments taken down stone by stone, and always, behind the throne, the sense that something older was watching. Meanwhile, the daily life of the palace rolled on. Rituals had to be performed at precise times. Meals prepared with ingredients harvested under the correct moon. Water drawn only from sacred wells. Even the air smelled rehearsed, sandalwood, lotus, burnt myrrh. Everything choreographed for the illusion of divinity. But underneath all that order lived something far more human. Fear. Not of war or famine, but of failure. Of being seen as impure. Of breaking the rules. A young girl named Nefret was once brought to the palace to serve as an assistant to the chief perfume maker. She came from a fishing village, had never seen stone walls so high or floors that gleamed like the river itself. On her second day, she accidentally spilled a small jar of oil near the statue of the falcon god Horus. It wasn't even seen by the priests, only by another servant. But by the next morning, Nefret was gone. Some said she'd been dismissed. Others claimed she was sent to work in the underground storage vaults where no sunlight ever reached. No one dared ask directly. Even small mistakes felt like crimes in a world so tightly controlled. And yet, for all its restrictions, life around the pharaohs continued. Families were raised, stories were told, bread was baked fresh each morning. The people outside the palace lived simpler lives, less watched, but still shaped by the strange shadow of their god-kings. Out in the fields near the edge of the Nile, farmers worked in the rising heat. Their tools were simple: wooden plows, baskets made of reeds, small clay pots filled with grain. But even in these quiet places, the presence of the pharaoh could be felt. His face appeared on the coins they never held. His name was part of their prayers, even when asking for rain. If a harvest failed, some would say it was because the pharaoh had lost favor with the gods. If it succeeded, it was credited to his divine wisdom. But what did the pharaohs believe? Did they truly think they were gods? Or were they trapped in a lie, as much as anyone else? There is a tale told in the upper regions of Egypt, along the banks of the desert cliffs, of a pharaoh who disguised himself one night and wandered through a nearby village. He wore simple linen, no jewelry, no crown. He wanted to hear what the people said about him when they thought no one important was listening. He sat near a fire, ate bread with laborers, and asked them what they believed happened after death. One man, older, with hands like tree bark, said he hoped to rest with his ancestors. Another laughed and said he just wanted to stop working. When the pharaoh asked what they thought of their ruler, the men went quiet. One finally said, "He lives far away. He does not see us." The pharaoh returned to the palace before dawn. By the time the morning ceremony began, his crown was on his head again, his feet washed in rose water, and the people bowed without seeing the tired look in his eyes. From then on, he changed. He no longer held court in public. He sent messengers instead. And the last law he passed was to build a second palace far from the capital, one no one else was allowed to visit. Its location has been lost to time. Perhaps the greatest secret of the pharaohs wasn't the magic they practiced, the tombs they built, or even the gods they claimed to speak with. It was the loneliness, the deep, quiet knowledge that everyone around them either feared them, wanted something from them, or hoped to outlive them. True friendship, true trust, those things could not grow in such cold, sacred soil. They surrounded themselves with statues instead. Hundreds of them. Gods, animals, ancestors. Some said the statues listened. Others believed they protected the pharaohs at night. But a few believed something darker, that the statues watched the rulers, kept them in line, and whispered back to whatever force had truly been in charge all along. As night fell over the desert, the palace would begin to change. Torches lit the halls with flickering shadows. Musicians played soft, droning melodies to lull the court into calm. The air cooled. The Nile shimmered under the moonlight. And deep beneath the palace floor, far below where the servants walked or the priests prayed, something shifted. A door that had not been touched in years creaked open just a fraction. Dust floated upward in slow spirals. And behind that door, silence. For now, the sound of that ancient door, just barely groaning open, was the kind of sound that no one should have heard. And yet someone did. A boy named Satu, an apprentice candlebearer no older than 10, had gotten lost on his way back from the storage vaults. His job was small and unimportant in the eyes of most. Carry candles from one end of the palace to the other and replace the ones that had burned low. But Satu had a habit of wandering. He was curious, too curious, and his eyes often lingered where they shouldn't. That night, while the halls were quiet and the guards nodded off at their posts, he had taken the wrong stairwell. It led him down into an area of the palace no one ever spoke of. The air smelled different there, cooler, older, and thick with something he couldn't name. He was just about to turn back when he heard it. The faint sound of stones shifting, like the breath of something ancient waking from a long sleep. He didn't see the door, only a corridor swallowed by darkness. His candle flickered wildly and then went out. In the pitch black, he stood frozen. A breath against his cheek made him turn and run, blindly, heart pounding. He never told anyone what he heard or felt down there. But from that night on, he refused to go near the lower halls again. Up above, the court continued as usual. Perfumed letters were delivered to ministers. Gossip spread through the kitchens, and the high priest recited lines from the Book of the Dead as though the gods were listening closely. But beneath it all, that strange shift had begun. Something old was turning in the silence. The hollow room, which had stood quiet for generations, suddenly became a place of interest again. The high priest requested additional guards near the south wing. He claimed it was for protection, that there were structural concerns. But many knew better. Those closest to the royal family felt the change. The Queen Mother, once proud and visible at court, stopped appearing in public. Her chambers remained sealed, even to her own servants. Some said she had fallen ill. Others claimed she had been visited in her dreams by something she could not explain. Those who served near her rooms spoke of strange smells at night, of whispers behind closed doors, and of a wet, clinging silence that lingered long after the torches were lit. The current pharaoh, Nebseni, was a young man but had already ruled for 9 years. Handsome, quiet, and unpredictable, he was known for keeping his thoughts guarded. He spent long hours alone in the temple gardens, tracing lines in the sand with his staff, or staring at the stone statues as if waiting for them to move. His voice was rarely heard outside ceremonies, and his eyes never gave away what he was thinking. Those closest to him feared that he was beginning to change, slipping further into that strange world where kings start to see themselves as gods, or worse, as something less than human. Some of his advisors began to worry in private. They noticed subtle things. His writing had become less careful, more frantic. The food tasters claimed his appetite had vanished. His personal physician, a gentle old man with cloudy eyes, was summoned more often than usual. When asked what troubled the pharaoh, the physician would only say, "He dreams too deeply." And then there was the matter of the broken seal. A sacred tablet, kept in the temple archives and bound by wax for generations, was found disturbed. The high priest swore it had not been touched in over 200 years. It was marked with the symbol of a vulture holding a twisted staff, a symbol few recognized anymore. The wax had cracked clean through, like something had split from within. The scroll inside had not been removed, but it had shifted, slightly, as if someone or something had tried to read it from the other side. No one dared speak of it openly, but behind closed doors the rumors spread fast. Some said the scroll was a warning, written by a priest long ago who claimed the line of kings would one day be broken from within. Others believed it contained a forgotten name, a name that had once been erased from every stone and scroll in the kingdom. A name cursed not to be spoken, not to be remembered, and yet, somehow, it was returning. Pharaoh Nebseni did not speak of the seal, but he did summon the palace architect, a thin, nervous man named Harkhuf, and asked him a strange question. "How many rooms are beneath the palace?" the pharaoh asked, his voice low. Harkhuf blinked. "Aye, my lord, there are 7 known levels, though the oldest plans suggest an 8th. And the 8th, the pharaoh pressed. No doors, only walls. It was sealed centuries ago, before your grandfather's time." Nebseni was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Draw me a map. Every stairwell, every passage, even the ones you fear." Harkhuf bowed and left, his face pale. Within a week, 3 masons were quietly ordered to reinforce a particular section of the palace floor near the southern wing. No one explained why. They worked only at night, under strict watch, and were forbidden to speak to one another. When one of them fell ill, he was not replaced. The other 2 were told to continue. When they finished, they vanished from court life completely. Their names no longer appeared on the labor records. The mystery deepened. Meanwhile, the sun continued to rise each day, casting golden light over the wide courtyards and lotus-filled pools. The priests continued to chant. Offerings were made. Papyrus scrolls were filled with daily accounts of crops, harvests, and temple donations. To the outer world, all seemed well. But those who lived within the inner walls, the scribes, the cooks, the quiet servants who knew which doors creaked and which voices whispered late at night, they knew something had shifted. Even the animals sensed it. The palace cats, once proud and playful, became skittish. They refused to enter certain halls. One was found hissing at an empty wall in the eastern corridor. Birds kept in cages near the gardens stopped singing altogether, as if holding their breath. And still, in the lowest part of the palace, that sealed door remained open by a sliver. No one had dared look inside. Not yet. But one person was getting closer. Layet, a young girl from the archives who had grown up among scrolls and dust, had begun to notice strange inconsistencies. She was not highborn, not trained in magic or prophecy, but she was careful, observant, and she had come across an old map, one with markings that didn't appear on the modern plans. It showed a chamber buried beneath the south wing, a space labeled only with a single glyph, silence. Layet couldn't stop thinking about it. She wasn't drawn by ambition or greed, only curiosity, that soft, steady pull that made her sneak out late at night with a single oil lamp and the map hidden under her robe. She didn't tell anyone. She barely told herself. But the path was already unfolding, and deep beneath her feet, something in the dark was listening, waiting. Layet moved silently through the palace corridors, her sandals barely making a sound on the polished limestone floors. It was long past midnight. The scent of burnt cedar still clung to the air from the last temple ritual, and the oil lamp she held flickered with every breath of wind. She had taken the servant path near the granary to avoid the guards, steps she'd memorized not from rebellion, but from routine. She was the kind of girl no one noticed, which had become her greatest advantage. The map was folded and tucked beneath her sash, close enough to feel against her ribs. It had taken her weeks to find it, hidden behind a loose stone in the back room of the archives, a room so dusty and unused even the spiders had given up spinning webs. It wasn't just a map, though. Along the edges, in faint, crumbling ink, were notes written in a hand older than her grandfather's generation. Warnings, perhaps, or records. It was hard to say. One word kept repeating itself in different forms. Sealed. But sealed didn't mean gone. It didn't mean forgotten. She followed the path marked on the map, down the winding rear staircases and across the half-flooded storeroom beneath the gardens. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. The palace above felt like a different world. Here, everything echoed. Even her quietest steps bounced back at her in strange, uncertain ways. The torchlight showed carvings on the walls, not the grand figures of gods and kings, but more primitive shapes. Symbols scratched deeply into the stone with rough, urgent hands. As she rounded a bend in the lowest hallway, the air shifted. A strange current brushed past her, like the breath of something that had been asleep for too long. Her heart began to pound, not from fear, not yet, but from the realization that she was not alone down there. Something about this part of the palace made her skin prickle, the way it does when someone stares at you from behind. Then she saw it, the door. It wasn't grand or gilded like the ceremonial entrances upstairs. It was plain stone, marked only by a single vertical crack where it had slightly separated, just enough to reveal blackness behind it. Layet stepped closer, and the flame in her lamp thinned and hissed, struggling against some invisible draft leaking from the space beyond. She could smell something faint now, damp stone and something older, metallic like the scent of coins left in water too long. She hesitated. Her training had taught her that the past was to be read, not touched. That some things, especially in this palace, were hidden for good reason. But the map had led her here, and a whisper inside her, whether it was her own curiosity or something else entirely, was urging her forward. She reached out and touched the edge of the door. It was cold, much colder than the air around it. Her fingertips tingled, and for a moment she thought she felt a pulse. Just once, like a heartbeat trapped in stone. She stepped back quickly, her own breath loud now in the narrow space. The flame danced, then steadied. Nothing moved. No voice called. No shadow shifted. But the weight in the air was heavier, like the room itself was aware of her. She didn't push the door open. Not yet. Instead, she sat on the stone ledge nearby and unrolled the map. Her eyes traced the lines again, searching for any detail she might have missed. And there, in the bottom corner, was a tiny mark she hadn't noticed before, almost an afterthought. It wasn't a word. It was a drawing. A single eye, carved in rough strokes, with lines radiating outward. She'd seen that symbol once before, in the temple's oldest storage chamber, on a broken statue buried under linens and dust. That statue had no name. Layet stared at the symbol, her fingers shaking slightly. The silence around her was no longer peaceful. It was expectant, like the moment before a drumbeat. Like the palace was holding its breath. Above her, the rest of the world kept moving. The court would rise soon. Priests would light incense. Servants would sweep floors, prepare morning bread, and refill the lotus bowls. None of them knew where she was. None of them knew what might be waiting just a few floors beneath their feet. In the royal chambers, Pharaoh Nebseni stood alone on his balcony, looking out across the dark gardens. He had not slept. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue, but his posture was still proud, still impossibly still. In his hand was a fragment of pottery, one he had taken from a locked chest 2 nights earlier. It bore the same eye symbol, etched roughly into the surface, barely visible under the glaze. His dreams had returned. They came each night now, vivid and endless. Always the same. He was walking through halls he didn't recognize, but somehow knew. The walls bled shadows. The statues whispered prayers not meant for human ears. And always at the end, a door. The same door, cracked open. A voice from behind it calling his name. Not the name given to him as Pharaoh, but his birth name. The one he hadn't heard in years. He didn't tell anyone. The high priest would say it was divine. The court seers would blame an imbalance of the stars. But Nebseni knew better. The dreams weren't messages. They were memories. He had been in that room before. Not in this life, perhaps. But somehow, somewhere long before he had worn the crown, he had stood before that very door. And now, someone else had found it. He could feel her presence, small but insistent, like a single flame in a room of smoke. He turned away from the balcony and disappeared into the chamber, the pottery shard still clutched in his hand. Down below, Layet stood again. She wasn't sure what had changed, only that something had. The feeling in her chest had shifted from fear to urgency. Like if she turned away now, the chance would be lost. Maybe forever. She stepped closer to the door, placed her hand flat against the stone, and leaned in just enough to whisper. "Who are you?" She didn't expect an answer, and none came, not in words. But the silence after she spoke felt different, heavier, as if the room beyond had heard her and decided, in that moment, to remember her voice. She didn't know it yet, but the moment would be marked. Later, someone would find her map, stained with oil and sweat, tucked beneath a broken floor tile. They would ask why she had gone there, why she had vanished without a sound. No one would have the answer, but the door would still be there, and the space behind it would no longer be empty. The torch in Layet's hand flickered wildly now, though there was no wind. Her skin felt clammy, and her breath came slow, each inhale thick as if the air itself was watching. She hadn't expected an answer when she whispered, but the way the silence shifted afterward unsettled her more than any reply could have. It was as if her voice had unlocked something. Not the door, not yet, but something older, something waiting to be acknowledged. She backed away a step. Her eyes stayed fixed on the thin crack in the stone, dark as ink. From this close, she could make out faint carvings that hadn't been visible before, scratches really, but deliberate, repeated shapes made by someone who had been desperate to speak through the wall. A handprint, a single line beneath it, then another, and another, countless, reaching downward. They weren't painted. They were etched deep into the stone with something sharp. Nails, perhaps. Layet swallowed hard. Her instinct screamed for her to leave. She could lie. She could say she had gotten lost, that her candle burned out and she was wandering back. No one would question her. No one ever did. That was the nature of being invisible, of being quiet, small, and ordinary. And yet, something held her there. Her fingers moved toward the map again, searching for another answer, another piece of context she might have missed. But the parchment felt damp now, sticky at the corners, like it had absorbed the moisture of the space around her. She unrolled it again. The ink along the bottom had begun to blur. The eye symbol was still there, but the lines that extended from it had spread, branching out like veins or roots, or cracks. Above her, the palace moved forward into dawn. Soft footsteps passed through sunlit corridors. Temple boys swept the floors of the sanctuary, and the sound of flutes floated out from the gardens where the first rituals of the day had begun. Incense filled the air again, warm and sweet. But the high priest was already uneasy. He had not slept either. A faint ringing had begun in his ears the previous night, low and constant, like a song heard through water. He told no one. Instead, he had begun the morning rites earlier than usual, as if trying to get ahead of something unseen. In Pharaoh Nebseni's chamber, the king stood motionless before a bronze mirror. His reflection stared back, but something about it felt off. The room was silent, but he kept hearing footsteps behind him, though no one had entered. The pottery shard he had carried earlier now rested in a bowl of salt near his bed. He had added a sliver of obsidian and a sprig of desert mint, as the old text advised. Protection, they said, though against what, none of them could say. He closed his eyes and saw the door again. The same one lay it now stood before. In his vision, it was always open just a little more than last time. Always waiting. He had once thought it was part of the dream world, but now he understood. The dreams were not prophecy. They were memory, and they were not just his. He turned to his scribe, who stood quietly in the shadows. "Send for the girl from the archives," he said, "the one who studies the forgotten texts." The scribe bowed. "What shall I tell her?" "Nothing," Nebseni replied, his voice low. "If she understands the path she's taken, she will come." But Layet did not hear the summons. She had not moved. The door remained closed, but something about it pulsed now, like a heartbeat felt through stone. She pressed her palm against it again and felt warmth, just a faint trace, as if someone had been on the other side only moments ago. She leaned her head in closer, her cheek brushing the cold surface. There was a sound this time. Not a word, not even a breath. It was a hum, so low it could be mistaken for silence, but it was there, a steady vibration, deep and ancient, like stone remembering its shape. She stepped back, her pulse quickening, and looked around the corridor. Nothing had changed. No guards. No other footsteps. The torch burned low but steady. She didn't realize her lips were moving until she heard herself whisper again. "What are you?" Again, no words replied. But this time, she felt something shift. Inside herself, it wasn't fear. It was recognition. Something inside her had always known she'd find this place. She didn't remember when it started. Maybe it had always been there, a soft pull, like the feeling of a word you almost remember but can't say out loud. The nights she spent in the archives, reading old scrolls no one touched anymore, she felt it. The way some passages called to her, the way forgotten names felt familiar. She knelt and placed the torch on the floor. Carefully, she reached into the satchel she'd brought, pulling out a tiny piece of carved bone. It was a pendant, shaped like a narrow tooth with a hole for a string. She had found it as a child in the reeds near the edge of the river, buried in wet soil. It had felt warm in her hand the moment she picked it up. She didn't know why she had brought it with her tonight, only that it had felt wrong to leave it behind. She pressed the pendant against the door. This time the hum stopped. The air grew still, so still that even her breath felt loud. The crack in the door seemed narrower, darker. The carvings faded back into shadow. Nothing moved, nothing called, but she knew she'd been seen. Not by eyes, not in the way of people, but something on the other side now knew her, had recognized something inside her. The thought filled her with a cold dread. She hadn't opened the door, but somehow something on the other side had stepped closer. She stood up, pocketed the pendant, and slowly picked up the torch. She couldn't open the door. Not yet, but she would return. She had to. And next time, she wouldn't come alone. Behind the door, the stone remained still. But in the records room, near the palace temple, the wax seal on a second scroll cracked without being touched. It was a scroll older than any in the archives, wrapped in linen and stored behind a panel few even knew existed. The wax didn't shatter. It split down the middle, quietly, as if cut by invisible hands. Inside, the parchment trembled slightly in the still air. The ink that had dried centuries ago began to run, forming new lines, new shapes. One word remained clear, returning. And above it a single eye, watching, always watching. The scroll that split open in the archives didn't make a sound, but the silence it left behind carried weight. A young temple assistant named Hamu, barely 14, had been assigned to clean the deeper storage shelves where even senior scribes rarely went. He wasn't supposed to touch anything, just dust, sweep, and light fresh incense in the corners. But when he entered the back chamber that morning, he felt something was off. The air had changed. Colder, despite the sun now heating the city above. The candle on his tray sputtered before he even reached the stone shelf. He saw the linen-wrapped scroll halfway unrolled, even though no one had entered the room since the last full moon. The wax seal, marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, lay broken on the floor, brittle pieces scattered in a perfect circle. He called for a senior scribe, stammering his words, but by the time anyone arrived, the air had settled. The candle flame stood straight. The scroll was still split open, though now the ink had run and left symbols no one could translate. But one word remained clear, and it was enough to send whispers through the entire archive staff. Returning, the high priest, upon hearing of the incident, demanded the scroll be sealed again and placed in the temple of Hathor under watch. But nothing written could be undone, and those who had seen it could not forget. Worse still, others began speaking of dreams, shared dreams. People who had never met described the same long hallway, the same door, the same feeling of being watched. In the palace, Pharaoh Nebseni's orders changed. His quiet calm became more urgent. He sent word to priests in distant temples, requesting artifacts and records long buried. He summoned desert traders, astrologers, even one former magician who had once been banished for practicing unsanctioned rituals near the Valley of the Kings. He ignored protests from his council and overruled the temple's advice. Something in his eyes had changed, darker, distant, as if part of him was already somewhere else. Even his sister, Princess Rakura, noticed it. She had always been close to her brother, more so than anyone else. As children, they would sneak out to the temple gardens and pretend the gods lived in the trees, hiding messages in the rustling leaves. But now, when she looked at him, she saw something unfamiliar. His hands trembled when he thought no one was watching. He sometimes mumbled to himself in a language she didn't know. He forgot names, even hers once, and when he looked at her again, his face was pale, full of shame or fear. Rakura started her own quiet search. She questioned the servants, pressed the old nurses for stories from before Nebseni's birth, and followed her own path through the palace. One night, she found a hidden passage behind her chamber wall. Nothing strange in a palace built on centuries of secrets, but what struck her was the cold air leaking from the darkness beyond, and the scent, like earth, metal, and time itself. In the lower quarters, Layet had not returned to the door. Not yet, but the pull had grown stronger. She kept the pendant with her always, hanging from a cord beneath her robes. It felt warmer now, especially when she passed through the south wing. She didn't understand why, but she had begun to see things in her dreams. Rooms she'd never entered, names she'd never learned but could suddenly pronounce with ease. One dream stood out. In it, she stood before the door, but it was already open. Inside, a long corridor led to a chamber lit by fireless light. On the walls, carvings moved like shadows, alive but silent. And at the center stood a figure, tall, robed, with no face. She didn't feel fear. She felt recognition. But just as the figure raised its hand to her, she woke. The next day, a scribe from the royal court came to find her. He bore the seal of the pharaoh and spoke with quiet urgency. His Majesty requests your presence. There are matters of the archives that concern him. Layet didn't speak. She only nodded and followed. Her hands trembled slightly, but her steps remained steady. Somehow, she had expected this. Meanwhile, other things were stirring outside the palace walls. Word of omens spread through the city. The Nile had risen early this season, too early. Birds flew in strange patterns. A statue in the southern shrine reportedly wept black resin, though priests quickly dismissed it as a crack in the stone. But whispers grow faster than facts, and fear travels on quiet feet. The Temple of Sekhmet reported a disruption during a nighttime ritual. Several priests collapsed mid-chant. They spoke of a presence entering the room, something they couldn't see but could feel pressing against their chests, heavy and ancient. The head priest, a woman named Manita, declared it a false god, a shadow rising from an age before the known pantheon. Her words were not welcomed. She was silenced the next day and sent away to a desert retreat under the guise of health. The Pharaoh's council, made up of scholars, generals, and noble elders, began to divide. Some believed Nebseni had become unstable. Others feared he had uncovered something too sacred, too dangerous. But none dared move against him. Not yet. Power was one thing. Knowledge was another. And if the Pharaoh truly knew something they didn't, they needed to stay close. One of the generals, old Commander Terah, started keeping personal guards in his quarters. He remembered an event from his youth, something that had been erased from the records. A night when a sealed tomb was found open, the priests refusing to enter, and the silence that followed when the men who did go in never returned. The pattern was familiar now. Seals breaking, names returning, whispers in the dark. All of it connected somehow to that room beneath the palace. Layet entered the king's chamber just before sunset. The guard stepped aside without a word. Nebseni stood by the window, back to her, hands clasped behind him. She waited, unsure if she should speak. When he turned, he didn't greet her as a king. He looked at her with tired eyes and said softly, "You've seen it too, haven't you?" Layet didn't lie. "I have." He nodded, as if the confirmation didn't surprise him. "You carry something," he said. "A piece of it." Layet touched the pendant beneath her robe. "I don't know what it means." "You will," he said. Then after a pause, "You were chosen, long before you were born. Some bloodlines stretch through time, sleeping inside names no one remembers. But the past doesn't forget." She said nothing. He motioned for her to come forward. On the table beside him lay scrolls, maps, symbols scratched on thin clay tablets, some new, some ancient. And all of them pointed to the same place. "The door is not just a room," Nebseni said. "It's a return, a passage, and what waits beyond it remembers everything." Layet looked up at him. "Then why does it call to me?" Nebseni's eyes darkened. "Because it's waking up, and somewhere beneath their feet, in the oldest part of the palace, the stone shifted again. This time, more than just a breath. Something ancient stirred, not fully formed but aware. The crack widened, the silence deepened, and the shadows on the far side of the door leaned in, listening, watching, waiting. The room stayed silent after Nebseni spoke, but his words hung heavy in the air, settling between them like dust that refused to fall. Layet's breath caught in her chest. Not from fear exactly, at least not the kind she could name. It was something older than fear, a feeling she hadn't known she carried until now. Something inside her had known this moment would come, though she'd never dreamed it would be in the presence of a pharaoh, let alone about a door buried beneath the palace. Nebseni moved slowly, carefully, like a man standing on the edge of something too deep to see. "Before I was crowned," he said, his voice low, "I had a vision. It came without warning, during the coronation rites. I collapsed before the final prayer. The priest said it was exhaustion. But what I saw, what I heard, it never left me. I saw the door, not just from the outside, but from within. I saw the chamber beyond. A circle of light, no fire. Walls that bled like flesh. And voices, not speaking in words, but in feeling. Calling me by name." Layet stared at him. Her fingers gripped the cord of the pendant beneath her robe. "You heard them too?" Nebseni nodded. "Every night since." The two stood in silence, staring at the same symbols, the same maps and cracked scrolls on the table. All paths led to the south wing. All records, no matter how faded, hinted at the same forgotten passage beneath the palace. And all of them warned in their own way, "Do not open what was once sealed." "Why now?" Layet asked, her voice barely a whisper. "If it was buried for centuries, why is it waking now?" The pharaoh looked toward the western horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip low, bathing the city in orange. Because time is a circle, and some things wait patiently for it to turn. Elsewhere in the palace, Rakura pressed her ear against the stone wall of a forgotten hallway near the queen mother's quarters. She had returned again to the hidden passage she'd discovered the week before. This time, she brought a single candle and a small bronze mirror, just as her old nurse had taught her long ago, for protection and reflection. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that she couldn't ignore the sound that had returned each night. Faint footsteps on stone, always just beyond the wall. No one else seemed to hear them. Not the guards, not the maids, just her. And tonight, they were louder. The walls vibrated faintly, not with noise, but with energy, like something shifting deep beneath the floor. She whispered a prayer to Hathor, goddess of protection, and stepped deeper into the passage, brushing aside old cobwebs and forgotten cobblestone. The air was thick, warm, humming with something unseen. She didn't know her brother had spoken the same words earlier that day, or that the girl from the archives had stood before the door itself. But in her own way, Rakura felt it too. Something was coming undone. And whatever waited beyond that door was no longer content with silence. Back in the city, just outside the temple district, a sculptor named Manai worked late into the night. He carved figures for the temple of Thoth, standard gods, nothing unusual. But recently, he had begun seeing a different shape in his mind. A figure cloaked in shadow, arms outstretched, head covered in a cloth that hid its face. He couldn't remember where he'd first seen it, but his hands sculpted it on their own now, each time faster than before. He destroyed the first two, thinking it was madness. But the third statue, he couldn't bring himself to break it. It felt like something watching him. The whispers reached even him, though he knew nothing of the palace secrets. Nothing of Layet or Nebseni or the sealed door beneath the south wing. But in his dreams, he now saw a hallway. Always the same. A single flame lighting the path. And a voice just beyond the edge of hearing, calling a name that wasn't his, but felt like it belonged to him anyway. In the palace archives, the senior scribes discovered something missing. The ancient scroll, the one that had cracked open on its own, was gone. No signs of forced entry. No guards reported movement. But the shelf was empty, and the wax seal shards were swept away. The only mark left behind was the eye symbol, freshly carved into the stone of the wall beside the shelf. No one admitted to doing it. No one even knew what it meant. But the high priest, when he saw it, turned pale and demanded silence. That evening, he ordered a special ritual to be held under the new moon, a rare purification rite not performed since the reign of Ahmose, over 300 years ago. The temple's oldest surviving texts described it as a warding ceremony, a last line of defense against the rising of the nameless ones, those erased from the memory of gods and men alike. But not everyone agreed. Several of the younger priests had begun to question the high priest's decisions. They whispered among themselves, debating whether these rituals were helping or making things worse. Inside the pharaoh's chamber, Layet stood over a scroll, now half unrolled across the floor. It was one she had brought herself, taken secretly from the archives days ago. She had translated the older writing by memory, matching glyphs to patterns she'd only seen once before in the valley tombs. The story it told was strange, incomplete. It spoke of a king who was never crowned, a priest who was never buried, and a chamber sealed not by stone, but by oath. There were gaps in the scroll, burned or smudged, but she had written what she could. 3 phrases repeated over and over. The door is not a door. He returns not in body, but in knowing. When the name is spoken, the shape becomes flesh. Nebseni stared at the words for a long time. Then he looked up. "We can't tell the council." "Not yet." Layet nodded. "They wouldn't believe it anyway." He motioned toward the pendant beneath her robe. "That symbol, the eye, it's older than any written name. It's from before the gods had faces." "How do you know?" she asked. Because it's the same symbol for my dreams, he said. The same one I saw in the flame that never burned. I think whatever is behind that door doesn't want worship. It wants remembrance. And that was the heart of it. Not power, not destruction, but memory. To be remembered is to exist. To be forgotten is to vanish. And this presence, this thing, had waited too long in the dark. Leia understood now. The dreams, the pendant, the map, none of it had been random. She had been chosen, yes, but not by destiny, by something older, something patient, something that had watched from behind stone for centuries, waiting for the moment when the world would remember. She turned toward the door again in her mind. She could feel it, open wider now. She didn't need to be there to sense it. It was calling not just to her anymore, but to everyone who had once stood near its forgotten threshold. The veil between now and then was thinning, and whatever waited behind that door was stepping closer. Leia couldn't sleep anymore. Even when she closed her eyes, the door was there, closer now, clearer, as if the space between them was shrinking every hour. It haunted her even in daylight. She'd catch herself tracing the shape of the eye in the margins of scrolls or staring at shadows too long, waiting for them to move. The pendant she wore no longer felt warm. It pulsed, faintly, like it had a heartbeat of its own. The palace was shifting too. Not physically, not in any obvious way, but the mood had changed. Everyone could feel it. The servants whispered behind curtains. Guards stood longer at their posts, eyes darting into the dark corners. Even the wind that passed through the halls at night seemed heavier, carrying with it the scent of something that didn't belong, like damp earth and metal left to rust. Rumors of the broken scroll had begun to spread. No one said it aloud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Something old had been disturbed, and now it wouldn't rest. Pharaoh Nebseni grew more withdrawn. He spent hours locked in his chambers, speaking to no one but Layet and, on occasion, his sister Rakura. He no longer attended the temple rituals, which sparked concern among the high priests. But he didn't explain himself. Instead, he sent for a collection of scrolls stored far from the capital, hidden in the burial archives of a sunken temple. Only one man alive had seen them, an elder named Aket, once exiled for questioning the gods. Aket arrived under cover of darkness. He was thin, hunched with age, and spoke slowly, like each word carried weight. When Layet and Rakura met him in the lower gardens, he didn't bow. He only looked at Layet, eyes pale and sharp, and said, "You've seen it too, haven't you? The eye that never closes." Layet nodded. He reached into his robes and pulled out a scrap of dark cloth. Unfolding it carefully, he revealed a fragment of sandstone, no larger than her palm, etched with the same symbol, an eye surrounded by branching lines. But on this one, there was more. A mark just below it. A name, not written in the common glyphs, not in any language used today. But when Layet saw it, her mind translated it without effort. Not in words, but in meaning. It was a title, He Who Waits Beneath. Aket looked at her again. "You know why it calls to you," he said. "Because you've carried it before. We all have. This isn't the first time." Layet shook her head, confused. "What do you mean?" The seal wasn't broken by accident. It was broken because the world forgot its purpose. The moment we stopped remembering, the door began to open. Rakura stepped forward, troubled. "Then what's behind it?" Aket didn't answer right away. His eyes turned toward the palace. Something not of the gods, not a man. Something that was sealed away not by prayer or power, but by silence. And silence is failing. Meanwhile, deep below the palace, in a chamber even the architects no longer remembered, the door had opened just slightly more. Not enough for anyone to see through, but enough for something on the other side to listen. The vibrations were no longer quiet. Servants began hearing soft knocks echoing through the walls. The palace cats refused to enter certain rooms. Statues, ancient ones near the oldest halls, developed cracks in the middle of the night. One of them collapsed entirely, though no one was near it. When they examined the pieces, they found the inner stone had rotted, as if eaten from the inside out. The high priest ordered a cleansing of the wing. Incense, blood offering, re-sanctification of the floors. But it didn't stop the knocking. Layet, with the pendant pressed to her chest, returned to the door. This time, she wasn't alone. Rakura came with her, silent but unafraid. Nebseni had sent guards to watch the entrance to the lower corridors, but they had turned back before reaching the last hall. One claimed he saw his own shadow move in the torchlight. Another swore the walls were breathing. They refused to return. So it was only the two women now, guided by instinct more than plan. The stone door stood waiting, unchanged and yet so clearly different. The crack had widened, not by much, but just enough for Layet to feel the cold air leaking out again. This time, the carvings on the surface glowed faintly. Not light exactly, but something beneath the stone shimmered, like it was reflecting a fire deep within the wall itself. Rakura reached out and touched the side gently. "It's not just a room, is it?" she asked. Layet didn't answer. She was listening. There was a sound now, just barely audible, like humming, like breath, like hundreds of voices whispering at once, just out of reach. She stepped closer and felt it. Not fear, not yet, but pressure. Like the air was thickening around her, pushing against her ears and chest. Behind the door, something moved. Not loudly, not quickly, but it moved. Layet staggered back, gasping. She grabbed Rakura's arm. "It knows we're here," she said. Then came the knock. Just once. A deep, hollow knock that echoed through the chamber and rattled the stone at their feet. Rakura's face turned pale. "We have to seal it." But Layet was already shaking her head. "It's too late." In the palace above, Nebseni stood at the edge of the great temple courtyard, where the final preparations for the purification rite had begun. The high priest moved like a man possessed, chanting faster than usual, pouring libations of wine and oil into the sacred fire. But the flames refused to rise. Instead, they turned black at the center, smoke curling up like ink in water. The priests began to panic. One cried out that the gods had turned their backs. Another dropped his staff and fled. Nebseni didn't move. He watched the black flame, eyes unblinking. And then it spoke. Not in sound, but directly into his mind. "It is open." He staggered back. In the hidden chamber below, the stone beneath Layet's feet cracked, just barely. Dust trickled from the ceiling. Rakura grabbed her arm, eyes wide. "We have to go." But Layet didn't move. She was hearing something too. Not a word. A feeling. A memory not her own. She saw a man, his face covered, standing before the same door, but in a time long gone. A priest, maybe, or a king. She saw him weep as he placed a seal across the opening. She saw the others behind him, chanting, faces grim. She felt their fear, their urgency, and she heard the words spoken aloud for the last time before the door was closed forever. When a name is spoken, the shape becomes flesh. The stone vibrated again. Louder. Rakura pulled her away. "Now, we have to run." They fled the corridor just as the last torch sputtered and died. The shadows behind them stretched unnaturally, reaching across the walls like arms. Above, in the temple, the flame exploded in a burst of black smoke, sending priests scattering. Nebseni stood in the center, unmoved, staring at the sky. The stars were shifting, not falling, not disappearing, shifting, forming a shape. An eye. The eye that never closes. The eye that watches from behind the door. And far below, behind cold stone, the presence stepped forward at last. Not through the door, but into memory, into thought, into the minds of those who had stood too close for too long. The return had already begun. The corridors echoed with the sound of hurried footsteps as Layet and Rakura climbed the worn stone steps two at a time. The silence behind them wasn't comforting. It was tense, like something was deciding whether or not to follow. Neither of them looked back. Their breath was shallow, their hearts racing. Somewhere deep below, in that ancient hall, the door still stood closed, but the world around it had started to change. By the time they reached the palace garden, the sky was darker than it should have been. Heavy clouds gathered above, though no storm had been predicted. The air was thicker too, almost sticky, and the birds had gone quiet. No chirping, no fluttering wings, just the low groan of wind brushing against the columns. Servants stood still, confused by the sudden shift in weather. Even the guards at the main gate seemed tense, hands resting on the hilts of their blades. The change was subtle, but everyone felt it. Something wasn't right. Layet leaned against the nearest column to catch her breath. Rakura wiped dust from her hands and looked toward the palace's upper levels. "We need to find my brother," she said, her voice trembling. "He'll know what to do." But Layet wasn't sure anymore. Nebseni had always seemed in control, always calm, but lately something had changed in him too. His voice had grown softer, his eyes more distant. Like part of him had already crossed over to whatever was behind that door. They found him in the temple courtyard, standing alone in the center where the sacred fire had turned to ash. Blackened fragments of burned offerings surrounded him, and the priests had fled, murmuring curses and protection spells as they ran. The ceremony meant to seal away the danger had failed. The sky had darkened further, and even the wind had fallen silent now. When Nebseni looked up at them, his expression held no surprise, just exhaustion, and maybe grief. "It's begun," he said. Rakura stepped forward. "Then we have to stop it." Nebseni didn't move. "We can't stop it. Not anymore. We can only prepare for what comes next." Layet clenched her jaw. "What is coming?" Nebseni lowered his eyes. "The return." From the shadows of the courtyard, a quiet voice spoke. "I warned you." It was Aket, the elder scholar. He stepped into the light slowly, wrapped in a long robe marked with protective symbols. "You knew what the signs meant. You read the scrolls. You saw the cracks in the walls, the dreams, the eye in the sky. But still you waited." Nebseni didn't argue. He simply nodded. "I needed to be sure." Aket frowned. "And now we all pay the price." The sky gave a deep rumble, not thunder, but a low vibration that passed through the bones like a memory. The water in the garden basins rippled. Somewhere in the distance, the temple bell rang by itself. The people of the city were gathering. Not in protest, not yet. Just standing still, looking upward. No one could say why, but the moment had arrived when fear outweighed routine. Markets were abandoned. Fires were left unlit. Children clung to their mothers. And far off, near the desert's edge, the oldest priests had begun preparing for a journey they had long feared. A return to the sealed tombs of kings forgotten even by the gods. Layet stared at Nebseni. "If we can't stop it, then what do we do?" He turned to her slowly. "We remember." She didn't understand at first. "Remember what?" "Everything." His voice was soft, almost broken. "The names, the oaths, the silence. The ones who came before us and buried what should never have been known. That's what this is about. Not worship, not offerings. Memory. If we forget, it walks free." Rakura looked between them. "You mean it's feeding on us forgetting?" Nebseni nodded. "Yes. The world has forgotten its own shadow. And now the shadow wants to be seen again." Aket raised his hand and pointed toward the palace. "Then we must go back down, before it crosses into our world fully." Layet's stomach tightened. She didn't want to go back down. Not after what they'd seen. Not after that knock. But deep down, she knew it had to be them. No one else would understand. No one else would see the truth in what waited beyond that door. Nebseni gathered his robe and turned toward the south wing. "We go now, before the last crack opens." Together, they moved through the palace like ghosts, taking back corridors and service staircases, trying not to be seen. The guard no longer asked questions. The whispers had grown too loud. They passed people frozen in place, staring blankly at nothing, eyes glazed, as if listening to something just beneath the surface of sound. They reached the lower halls, where the air turned colder again. Dust floated in thick beams of light from flickering torches. The stone beneath their feet groaned. Even the walls looked different now, darker, veined with strange patterns that hadn't been there days before. Layet led them to the door. It looked the same, but felt heavier, like time itself was pressing against it. The crack was wide enough now to fit a hand through. Faint light, flickering, shifting, unnatural, shined from the other side. The carvings on the door pulsed with a rhythm none of them could match. Not music, not language, but a pattern like a forgotten lullaby. Nebseni stepped forward. "Do not speak the name." They all nodded. No one dared test fate. Aket drew a small blade from his sleeve. "This was made from the teeth of the desert cat," he said. "It holds memory. We use it to trace the symbol." He knelt before the door and carved the eye into the dust. Around it, he drew circles, words, and symbols of protection. He instructed Rakura and Layet to repeat each word after him. Together, they whispered the names of guardians long dead, of gods erased from temples. They called on memory not to return, but to seal. But the door groaned. It didn't like being resisted. The torches flared suddenly, burning blue. The stone beneath the eye symbol cracked. Then came a sound. A voice, not loud, not screaming, just present, deep, dry, like wind passing through a tomb. It said nothing either of them could understand, but they felt it. Each word fell like a drop of ice into their minds. And one thought pulsed through all of them. You remembered too late. The stone trembled. Layet dropped to her knees, clutching her pendant. Her head throbbed. Visions raced behind her eyes. Images of cities burning, of kings kneeling before a presence wrapped in shadow, of doors swinging open in hundreds of places at once, of people forgetting who they were, and of a name echoing across centuries. She screamed. The vision stopped. Nebseni pulled her back. Rakura held her hand. Aket finished the final mark in the dust. Then the door stopped shaking, not because the danger was gone, but because the presence was no longer just behind it. It was inside them now, watching, listening, waiting for the moment they would slip. One word, one name, and it would return in full. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise. They had finished the ritual, drawn the symbols, whispered the names. Yet something still watched from behind their thoughts. The air in the corridor was thick, unmoving, and the door no longer trembled, but not because they had succeeded. Layet could feel it in her bones. The danger hadn't passed. It had simply moved closer. She stood slowly, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the pendant, her breath uneven. Nebseni's face had gone pale. His lips moved soundlessly, as if he were still repeating the protective words out of habit. Rakura clutched his arm, eyes flicking toward the faint light leaking from the crack in the stone. "Is it still behind the door?" she whispered. Aket didn't answer right away. He turned and looked at them all, then slowly at the wall opposite the seal. "No," he said. "It's not." That was when the stone behind them shifted. It was a slow, grinding sound like stone sliding against stone, but it didn't come from the sealed door. It came from the ceiling. A section above them quivered, then cracked. A layer of dust rained down. They stepped back quickly as a square slab groaned open, revealing a second passage, hidden in the ceiling itself. No one moved. Layet's throat was dry. That wasn't on any of the maps. Aket stepped forward cautiously, holding his hand near the opening. The air that escaped wasn't cold like the chamber below. It was warm, metallic, tainted with something unfamiliar. And it smelled old, older than the tombs, older than the palace. Nebseni frowned. "Where does it go?" Aket's eyes were distant. "Not where. When?" The others stared at him. Layet took a step closer. "What are you saying?" He looked at her carefully, almost sadly. "The door behind us is only half of it. A prison built to hold something in place, not just in space, but in time. It wasn't just sealed behind stone. It was sealed behind memory, behind forgetting." Nebseni shook his head. "You told me the door was built to contain a presence." "It was," Aket said. "But the door is not the only lock. The memory of the past itself was part of the seal. When we stopped remembering, it started to bleed through." Rakura looked up at the dark passage above. "And what's up there?" Aket hesitated. "A mirror, a wound, a second path, where the presence once lived before it was forgotten. If it is rising again, so too will the world it once ruled." Layet felt cold despite the warmth leaking from the opening. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. She understood now why the presence hadn't fully crossed through the first door. It didn't need to. The second door was already open. Nebseni turned to the others. "We need to see it." Rakura blinked. "Climb into a ceiling we didn't know existed, through a path into some other time." Nebseni didn't blink. "Yes, before it becomes ours." Together, with torches lit and the pendant still pulsing in Layet's hand, they climbed. The stone path above was narrow, just wide enough for one person at a time. The air shimmered strangely, like the heat waves over desert sand, but they weren't sweating. They moved through a tunnel lined with smooth stone, different from the ancient brick of the palace. This was older, polished, carved with symbols they didn't recognize. Layet paused once to run her hand across one. It felt like glass, but when she looked closer, the surface absorbed the torchlight instead of reflecting it. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a chamber. It was vast, far larger than anything should have been hidden above the old corridors. And impossible. The ceiling arched high overhead, lined with a constellation that didn't match the night sky. The walls were covered in inscriptions, swirling and shifting like liquid, refusing to stay still. And at the center stood a pedestal. Upon it rested a slab of obsidian, as smooth as still water. It wasn't a mirror. It was a doorway. Nebseni approached it slowly. This isn't the past. Aket nodded solemnly. It's what came before history. Layet stepped closer, unable to look away. As she neared the surface of the black stone, her reflection appeared. But it wasn't her. Not exactly. The face staring back was older. Worn, eyes ringed with shadow. She blinked. So it did the reflection, but a moment too late. Then the image rippled, and another figure took her place. Rakura screamed. The shape in the mirror was tall, robed, its face covered in the same cloth from Layet's dreams. It raised its hand. Behind the cloth, something pulsed, an eye. The same eye carved into the pendant. The door, the map, the sky. A sound echoed in their minds. A low whisper. You looked. Layet stumbled back, breathing fast. Aket was shaking now. It knows we're here. This chamber was never meant to be entered. It's not a place, it's a memory. A preserved thought from before the world took shape. A place where the presence once ruled. Nebseni turned slowly. Then it's already coming through. The mirror shimmered again, and the room trembled. Cracks formed in the walls, thin veins of light leaking through. The ceiling stars began to rearrange themselves. No longer random. They were forming shapes, glyphs, messages. Layet's eyes widened. It's not just remembering. It's rewriting. Outside the palace, lightning cracked across the sky. But no thunder followed. Just silence. And then a pulse. A deep vibration that moved through the stone streets, rippling through the foundations of the city. Candles flickered out in homes. Temples stood still. The river Nile, always steady, shifted unnaturally, water bending in ways that defied nature, pulling back as though something deep beneath it had stirred. Aket turned to them with urgency. If we leave this chamber open, it will remake our world into its own memory. It won't need to escape. It will simply change everything to match what it remembers. Layet stepped back to the obsidian surface. Her voice was firm now. Then we have to shut it. Nebseni hesitated. We still don't know what it is. It doesn't matter, Rakura said, joining her. We know enough. We know it wants out. And we know it wants to take everything with it. A crack ran across the floor beneath them. The pedestal trembled. The eye in the mirror blinked. And then, just before the stone split again, a second voice echoed in their heads. Not cold like the first. Warmer. Familiar. Not all who remember serve him. Layet's head snapped up. Her pendant burned hot against her chest. Another shape appeared behind the one in the mirror. A smaller one, dressed in light, holding something in its hands. The pendant. And suddenly, Layet wasn't afraid. Not because the danger was gone, but because the battle hadn't yet been decided. And she was no longer alone. The chamber trembled again, but this time the fear that had filled Layet's chest loosened, just slightly. The second figure in the mirror stood firm behind the dark-robed shape. It glowed, not with fire or power, but with calm. Its face was hidden too, but not like the other. This one radiated peace. Its hands were gentle, and in its grasp, it held the same pendant Layet wore. She took a step closer, heart pounding but steady. The two figures in the mirror remained still, like reflections frozen between breaths. And yet Layet could feel a pull from both of them. One reaching through memory to rewrite what was forgotten. The other reaching through memory to remind, to protect. Rakura moved to her side and whispered, "What is that second figure? Is it with us?" Aket let out a breath he had been holding far too long. In old stories, there was balance. Every force had its opposite. Not a destroyer, but a guardian. Not worshipped like the gods, just remembered like a guide. Layet didn't blink. A guide through memory. The dark-robed figure shifted. The eye beneath the cloth flared slightly, sensing resistance. It raised a hand again, and this time, the black stone rippled like water touched by wind. Shapes stirred in the surface. Cities burning, people kneeling, doorways cracking open all across a land that no longer existed. But the figure behind it, cloaked in light, lifted its own hand. The surface steadied. The images dimmed. And Layet suddenly understood something deep in her bones. The door below the palace wasn't just about sealing something evil. It was about choosing what we remember. And memory itself had defenders. Nebseni stepped forward, his voice raw. "If this is a battle of memory, then what do we do?" Aket turned to him. "We remember the truth. We remember what was lost. We speak the names they tried to erase, not to free them, but to reclaim the memory for ourselves." The mirror pulsed again. The dark figure reached toward the surface. Its fingers brushed the inner glass. Cracks formed, and Layet knew. If that hand came through, the rest would follow. The past would bend the present, and all that was forgotten would become real again, not as stories, but as new reality. Suddenly, Layet's pendant burned so hot it hurt. She yanked it off and held it out. And for the first time, the light from her pendant cast a reflection onto the mirror instead of being swallowed by it. The second figure glowed brighter in response. Layet spoke, not knowing where the words came from. "You are not what we forgot. You are what we protected." The dark figure faltered. Its hand withdrew slightly. Rakura, unsure but brave, added her voice. "You are not the end. You are what we feared, but we are not afraid now." The stone floor shook again. Pieces fell from the ceiling, but the cracks that had begun to spread across the room's edges paused. Suspended, Aket crouched and began drawing a new circle in the dust with his finger. This one different from the protective ring before. He chanted softly, words from a tongue long buried. The syllables didn't make sense, but they echoed in Layet's ears like a song her grandmother might have hummed long ago. Nebseni looked toward the mirror. "Layet, if you have to make a choice between what comes through and what stays locked, can you do it?" She stared at the mirror, at both figures, at the path unfolding between memory and oblivion. Then she nodded. "I think I was always meant to." The dark-robed figure moved again, faster now. It reached not toward the glass, but toward the glowing figure behind it, trying to blot it out. The surface of the obsidian flared, threatening to split open. But Layet stepped forward and pressed the pendant flat against the stone. A bright light burst outward, not burning, not loud, but clear, like morning light cutting through fog. The figures inside the mirror froze. For a moment, all the air seemed to stop. The floor stilled. The cracks quieted. Then came a voice, gentle and firm, as if spoken by every ancestor who ever loved their children. "You may not remember everything, but you remembered enough." And with that, the mirror pulled back into itself. The figures vanished, absorbed into the obsidian like ink into water. The stone cooled. The chamber dimmed. The symbols on the walls faded, no longer shifting, just silent marks once again. Layet collapsed to her knees. Not from fear, not even from exhaustion, but from the weight that had finally lifted. Aket stood slowly, wiping his hands. "It's not over. But we bought time, and we remembered the truth." Nebseni stepped forward, helping Layet stand. "We'll seal this chamber. Bury it, not to forget, but to protect the memory." Rakura nodded. "And we'll teach others, so it doesn't happen again." They left the chamber slowly, taking one last look at the obsidian slab before sealing the path behind them. When they emerged from the ceiling tunnel and returned to the south wing, the storm had broken. The sky was clearing. The temple bell had gone silent, and the water in the Nile had returned to its natural rhythm. But the eye in the stars still lingered, dim now, almost invisible, watching, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Layet stood by the courtyard alone that evening, watching the horizon fade to dusk. She no longer felt the pendant pulse, but she kept it close, not as a weapon, but as a memory. Behind her, the priests returned to their rituals. The scribes resumed their copying. The palace buzzed again with life. But none of them would forget. Not anymore, because now someone remembered. And memory, even the quiet kind, was enough to hold the darkness back. For now, the night after they sealed the chamber, the palace felt strangely quiet. No knocks on the walls, no shivering flames, no strange symbols appearing in dust. It was as if the presence had finally given up, retreating back into silence. Layet walked alone through the upper corridors, still holding the pendant, though it no longer glowed or pulsed. The weight of it felt different now, less like a warning, more like a key that had done its job. Nebseni ordered the south wing to be sealed completely. Builders moved quietly at dawn, placing stone over the old passages, pouring clay and mortar until the once living halls were nothing but memory. No one asked questions. Those who had witnessed even a glimpse of what happened in those lower chambers knew better. And those who hadn't didn't want to know. The scrolls were returned to their cases, though some of the older ones were now carefully locked away. Layet and Aket worked together to record what they had seen, but only in fragments. The full truth was too heavy to be passed down as legend. Instead, they wrote symbols, patterns, protective words, hiding knowledge inside riddles, hoping those who might need them in some distant time would know how to read them again. Rakura, who had always longed for her own place in the world beyond being the pharaoh's sister, became a messenger between the palace and the temple. She carried word of what had happened not in full detail, but in spirit. She warned of the cost of forgetting, and she reminded everyone that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what we remember, it's what we choose to forget. Days passed. The sky remained clear. The Nile flowed without change. And yet, Layet couldn't shake the feeling that something was unfinished. The mirror in the upper chamber had gone still, yes. The presence behind the sealed door had been pushed back, yes. But there was a silence in her chest that didn't feel peaceful. It felt waiting. One evening, just before the first stars appeared, she walked out to the far edge of the palace gardens, where an ancient wall still stood untouched for generations. She sat under a fig tree and opened the old parchment where she had first drawn the eye symbol from memory. She traced the lines slowly, feeling them sink into her fingers again. And then she heard it. Not a voice, not a knock, a whisper, so faint it could have been her own thought, except it wasn't hers. It said her name, softly, twice. She froze. Layet, Layet. She stood slowly, heart pounding once again. Behind her, the garden shifted. The trees didn't move, but the shadows beneath them deepened. Not darker, just deeper, like the ground had become thicker, heavier. She turned toward the old stone wall, and there she saw it. A door, small, plain, half hidden by vines. It hadn't been there before. Not ever. She was certain. This part of the palace had no underground chamber, no staircase, no stories. But now there was a door. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped closer, every instinct telling her to turn back. Then she noticed something carved into the stone beside it. A single phrase, he remembers now. She didn't know what it meant. Not until she reached for the door. The pendant around her neck pulsed once. Then the door opened on its own. Inside was not a chamber. It was the same mirror, the obsidian slab. But this time it wasn't still. It showed not the past, not the ancient robed figure, not the eye. It showed her, but not as she was. Older, wiser, standing in the palace, wearing the robes of a priestess, surrounded by people calling her name with hope, not fear. And just behind her, in the mirror, the presence lingered, smaller now, no longer a towering shadow, but a faint shimmer, watching. Contained, not destroyed, because the twist was never about stopping it completely. It was about accepting that memory has two edges. The danger had not been the presence alone. It was that they had forgotten how to live with what they sealed. Not everything buried stays gone. Not everything remembered needs to be feared. Layet closed the door, and behind her the fig tree blossomed. Out of season, as if something ancient had finally exhaled. and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of remembering. The morning after the door appeared and disappeared again, Layet didn't speak of it to anyone, not even to Rakura. She kept it to herself, unsure whether it had truly happened or was just the final echo of something ancient trying to let go. But the way the fig tree had bloomed out of season stayed with her. It felt like a message, a soft confirmation that something had changed and not everything broken needed to be feared or fixed. Sometimes it simply needed to be understood. Life in the palace slowly returned to rhythm. The priests began rebuilding their ceremonies, though their chants now included a verse Layet had quietly added, one that referenced the eye, not as a curse, but as a watcher, a reminder. The symbol was carved into one of the hidden columns of the main hall, too faint for common eyes to see, but etched deeply enough to last for centuries. They had learned that forgetting could bring danger. So Layet ensured that even if the stories faded, the memory would remain, hidden in plain sight. Nebseni spent more time with his people after the events. His voice had softened, and his presence grew more human. He no longer carried the weight of being a god-king, but instead ruled like a man who had stood on the edge of something incomprehensible and returned. He and Aket would sit in the gardens some evenings, speaking in low tones about the old scrolls, the sealed door, and the things that still whispered behind stone. One evening, Layet and Rakura stood by the reflecting pool near the outer garden. The moon was full above them, its light soft and blue over the rippling water. The stars reflected perfectly in the pool, still and quiet. "Do you think it's really over?" Rakura asked. Layet thought for a long moment before answering. "Not over, but resting." Rakura nodded. "Do you still hear it?" The whisper. Layet smiled faintly. "Sometimes, in dreams, but it doesn't frighten me anymore." They stood in silence, the hum of crickets and the scent of night jasmine filling the air. The garden was alive again, not just with growth, but with peace. It was strange to think that beneath their feet, the corridor with the sealed door still existed, holding its place in time, in memory. But now it was no longer a threat. It was a lesson, a story. That night, Layet returned to her chambers and took out the pendant. It had cooled, its surface dull, but still beautiful. She placed it gently into a small carved box and sealed it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. If someone in the future needed it, they would find it. But for now, its work was done. The weeks passed, then months. The land healed. The Nile ran smooth. The harvests were strong, and the stars quiet. Layet grew older, her role in the palace expanding beyond whispers and ritual. She became a teacher, passing on subtle truths to those willing to listen. Never in grand speeches, never in warnings. Just in small details, in the way she traced certain symbols, the stories she chose to tell, the silences she let linger just long enough for meaning to settle in. But on the eve of the flood festival, years later, something strange happened. A child came to the palace. She wasn't from any known village. No one recognized her name. She had wandered into the city barefoot, carrying nothing but a smooth black stone and a strange pattern drawn on her palm in red ochre. The guards brought her to Layet, unsure of what to do. The girl didn't speak much, but when Layet knelt before her and gently took the stone from her hands, a chill passed through the room. Not a warning, but a memory. The stone shimmered in the light just slightly, and the girl, no older than 7, looked up and said, "It called to me." From under the river. Layet's breath caught. Aket, now frail and thin, arrived soon after. He studied the girl quietly, then the stone. He ran his fingers across the surface and looked at Layet. "It's not the same presence," he whispered, "but it remembers the same place." That night, Layet sat with the girl under the fig tree. The child had fallen asleep quickly, her head resting on Layet's lap. In her sleep, she murmured words Layet recognized, not from scrolls but from dreams, from the other side of the mirror. The twist was not that the presence had returned. It was that memory itself had grown stronger, that remembering had opened not just a seal, but a connection, not just to something dark, but to something old, something watching over. Layet looked at the stars. The eye was gone now, hidden, or perhaps just closed for a while. The sky looked peaceful. But her heart told her the story wasn't finished. Maybe it never would be. Maybe that was the point. Because memory is alive. And as long as someone remembered the door, the light, the whisper, and the balance, then the presence behind the door could sleep. But if ever the world forgot again, it would not return in anger. It would return as reminder. And someone else, maybe even that girl, will be ready to listen. Over the following months, the girl stayed at the palace under Layet's care. No one questioned it. People whispered that perhaps she was a gift from the gods, or a sign that the pharaoh's household was truly blessed. But Layet knew better. The girl, who told them her name was Mehi, had not arrived by accident. She was drawn, like Layet had once been. Not by blood, not by prophecy, but by something far older. By memory itself, which had once again stirred beneath the world's quiet surface. Mehi rarely spoke, but she listened. Always listening. She followed Layet through temple rituals and garden walks. She traced the faded glyphs in the stone walls with her fingertips, mimicking the ancient prayers without ever being taught. At night, she would sit beneath the fig tree with the black stone in her lap, humming a song no one had taught her. One night, when the moon was lowest, she whispered to Layet in her sleep, "It remembers me too." The dreams began to return, not with fear this time, but with questions. Layet would see glimpses of corridors she didn't recognize, mirrors in faraway places, and the face of the robed figure, distant now, almost blurred, watching her from the edge of waking thought. She felt no threat from it anymore. Only weight, like a story still waiting for its ending. Aket, now unable to walk without help, visited less often. But on a cool morning near the end of harvest, he asked to see Mehi again. Layet brought her to his chamber, where the walls were covered in scrolls and clay tablets. Aket studied the girl's hands carefully, his fingers trembling as he touched the faded ochre symbols that had never washed off her skin. "It's not just the memory that chooses," he whispered to Layet when Mehi stepped away to explore his scrolls. "Sometimes memory creates." Layet frowned. "Creates what?" Aket's tired eyes met hers. "The next keeper." The words settled heavily in her chest. She hadn't thought of herself that way before, as a keeper. She'd simply followed what called to her, held on when everything around her tried to pull her away. But she saw it now. Mehi was not a warning. She was a continuation. The presence had not died, not even returned, it had remained. Quietly, patiently, watching those who remembered, reaching for those who could carry the weight of its story. That night, Mehi sat with her beneath the fig tree again, the same place where the final hidden door had once opened. She asked, "What's behind the river?" Layet didn't answer right away. "Why do you ask?" "I see it when I sleep," Mehi replied. "Not like a dream. Like a place I've already been. Before I came here." Layet's hand found the girl's and squeezed it gently. Some places exist inside memory. Not in the way other places do. We don't travel to them. They travel to us. Mehi nodded. "It's calling again." The pendant in Layet's box, long silent, gave off a faint glow that night. Just a flicker, as if something deep in the sealed place had stirred once more, not in threat, but in awareness. The pharaoh, Nebseni, had grown older too. His once dark hair now turned silver, his eyes softer than ever. One evening he called Layet and Mehi to the private hall where his ancestors had once received visions. He looked at the girl thoughtfully, then turned to Layet. "When I go, she should not stay hidden. Let the people know her name. Not as prophecy, as memory. A name that won't be erased." Layet hesitated. "Will they understand?" Nebseni smiled gently. "Not yet, but they'll feel it, the way they feel the river, the sun, the past. They'll know when the time comes." So Mehi's name was carved, not into stone walls or temple doors, but into the secret books of the scribes who wrote what mattered. Not the grand victories or the births of kings, but the quiet things. The truths that held the world together. Time passed. The sealed chamber in the south wing remained undisturbed. The mirror behind the hidden ceiling stayed quiet. But every few years, a new child would dream of doorways, or a farmer's daughter would trace the eye symbol in the dust without knowing why. Each time it happened, Layet would hear about it. And each time, she would smile softly. The story was still alive. The final twist came years later, when Layet herself was near the end of her life. She sat beneath the fig tree one last time, the blossoms in full bloom. Mehi, now a young woman, sat beside her, still carrying the same black stone in a silk pouch around her neck. "I had a dream last night," Mehi whispered. Layat smiled, eyes closed. "Tell me." "I was beneath the palace. But the corridor was different. It wasn't broken. It was filled with people. They weren't afraid. They were singing." Layat's eyes fluttered open slowly. "Was the door open?" Mehi nodded. "Yes, but it wasn't a prison. It was a gateway." She paused, her voice quieter. "I think it's not the same anymore. I think it's changing with us." Layat's final breath came not with fear, but with peace. Because in that moment, she understood the true nature of memory. It doesn't only preserve the past. It reshapes it. It grows. And sometimes, when the keepers are ready, the things we feared most become the bridges to what comes next. When Layat was buried, it was without grand monuments or towering shrines. But beneath the fig tree, a small stone was placed, smooth, round, and black. And on it, carved carefully by Mehi's hand, was the eye. Not a warning, not a curse, just a memory. Still watching, still waiting, and finally at peace. Seasons turned quietly after Layat's death. The Nile continued to rise and fall in its rhythm. The fig tree blossomed every year now, even when it shouldn't. Some said it was sacred, others didn't question it at all. But those who had known Layat, even from afar, would sometimes walk past the tree in the morning light, pause beside the small black stone, and lower their head, not out of mourning, but as if acknowledging something older than loss, something that still lived. Mehi stayed within the palace walls, not because she was required to, but because she felt the story still unfolding around her. Her dreams hadn't faded. If anything, they had grown clearer, more vivid. Sometimes she saw herself standing in places she had never been. Caves beneath the desert, mountain ledges above forgotten temples, even small mud villages where children whispered the eye's name while playing in the dust. None of them knew the full story, but had reached them. Somehow, the memory had spread, gentle and slow, like water finding cracks in old stone. Aket had passed shortly after Layat, and with him went most of the scrolls too sacred to be copied. Mehi kept only fragments of his writings, some etched into clay, others carefully inked into cloth that she wore beneath her robes. But most of what she had learned, she had memorized. Not just the words, but the feeling, the sense that behind every forgotten truth, there was something living, waiting for someone to remember it kindly. One morning, as the sky turned the color of warm ash, a caravan arrived from the western border. Among them was an old man who claimed to be a priest, though his dialect was so old that few understood him. He brought with him a small box, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a single strand of golden reed. He had come a great distance, he said, because the door had moved. Mehi listened to him carefully. Her heart didn't race, but she felt the familiar pull in her chest, the one she always felt before something important. She took the box from him, thanked him softly, and led him to a chamber in the outer temple where he could rest. Then she unwrapped the box alone under the fig tree, just as Layat had done years ago. Inside was a mirror, not obsidian, not polished glass, but something else entirely. It shimmered in the light like still water, even though it was dry. And when Mehi looked into it, she didn't see herself at all. She saw the girl she used to be, walking barefoot into the city, carrying a stone she didn't understand. And beside her, walking in silence, was Layat. But Layat didn't look as she had in her final years. She was younger, standing tall, eyes clear and warm. She turned the mirror and smiled at Mehi. Not a ghost, not a memory. Just acknowledgement. Behind them, the dream corridor stretched out once more. The door was open, but it no longer radiated threat. There was no "I" carved above it now. Only a symbol Mehi hadn't seen before, a flame inside a circle. She traced down her palm instinctively. The mirror flickered. The image faded. But Mehi understood. The presence hadn't disappeared. It had transformed, because enough people had remembered not with fear, but with understanding. And that had changed it. Not erased the darkness, but balanced it. Over the next weeks, Mehi began carving the flame circle symbol into new places. She placed it on a stone marker at the temple's edge. She gave it to children on clay amulets. She painted it on the inside of bowls at the bottom, so people would find it only after finishing their food. Quiet symbols, unspoken, but ever-present. And the people began to feel different, not in grand, noticeable ways, but in the smallest ones. They spoke more gently in the streets. They took longer walks along the river. They began to share older stories again, ones they had been told to stop telling because they didn't fit in the newer ways of worship. But now, those stories felt safe again. Familiar, like returning home after forgetting how to get there. Years passed, and Mehi grew older. Her hair turned silver early, and her eyes became deep with silence. She didn't lead like a priestess or rule like a queen. She simply was, always present, always listening. And when people asked her what she believed, she would say only this: the past watches, and it listens. And when we remember with love, it remembers us back. On the last day of her life, a sandstorm rolled in from the south, a slow-moving wall of golden wind. Mehi stood outside the palace gates as the sky turned thick and glowing. People had gathered inside, fearful of the storm's size, but she didn't hide. She stood still, arms open, eyes closed. And when the wind finally reached her, it slowed. The sand didn't cut or burn. It circled her, gently, like a hand brushing her shoulders. And in that moment, every leaf of the fig tree turned upward, catching the light like bowls receiving rain. Then the storm passed, and Mehi was gone. No body, no sound, only her sandals in the sand, beside a new stone. Smooth, black, etched with the flame inside the circle. After that day, the storm never returned. The fig tree bore fruit every year. And children who had never met her still dreamed of her face, calm, glowing, walking down a corridor that no longer led to fear. Because the truth had never been about destroying what was behind the door. It was about changing the story we told about it. And when enough hearts remembered it with gentleness, even the oldest shadows learned how to rest. Years turned into generations, and Mehi's story slipped from history into legend. Not because people forgot her, but because the truth became too sacred to speak aloud. Elders told children about the silver-haired woman who walked into the wind and vanished, and about the tree that bloomed even in the coldest months. The black stone with the flame inside the circle remained under the fig tree, untouched and never dusty, as though time itself had agreed to leave it alone. In nearby villages, people began to leave small offerings beneath the tree. Not out of worship, but gratitude. Little clay bowls, tiny carvings of eyes or flames, flat stones with names etched carefully in childish script. Sometimes, a traveler would find themselves stopping under its branches without knowing why. They would sit, close their eyes, and feel something move inside them. A forgotten story, a name they hadn't heard since childhood, a dream that suddenly felt real again. But none of this was strange to those who truly listened. They knew the truth had changed. The presence behind the sealed door had not been destroyed. It had been softened, not by force, but by remembering. And memory, passed gently between hands, had begun reshaping everything. Far across the desert, beyond the last known settlements, a group of seekers found an old ruin half buried in sand. The walls were worn smooth, the markings barely visible. But one of them, a young woman with dreams too old for her years, traced a faint shape with her fingers and gasped. There it was, the flame inside the circle. They didn't know the full story. They didn't need to, but they knew they'd found something important. The leader of the group, a quiet scholar, whispered, "It's not just a symbol. It's a message." From that day forward, stories started to rise again. Whispers of a line of memory keepers, not chosen by birth or rank, but by feeling. People who remembered things they'd never been taught, who knew how to calm fear with silence, who could touch old stone and hear its thoughts. And while few had seen it for themselves, many believed that somewhere beneath the earth, the sealed door still existed, not locked, not glowing, not threatening, but resting, at peace. Until one night, long after Mehi was gone and her name etched in only the quietest places, the door stirred. Not with violence, with warmth. A low hum pulsed through the earth, felt only by a few, those who had inherited the memory through the way they walked, the way they listened. The hum was not a warning, but a call. In a mountain village, a boy woke from a dream he couldn't explain. In the dream, he had stood before a vast mirror, not obsidian this time, but clear like still water. In it, he saw many faces behind his own. Women, men, children, all calm, all waiting. And in the dream, one of them stepped forward, a girl with silver hair. She placed a hand on the boy's chest and said, "You don't carry the fear. You carry the story." The boy woke with tears in his eyes. He did not understand the words, not yet. But he felt it, that something was about to begin again. Not a curse, not a danger, a continuation. Back in the old city, beneath the fig tree, the stone warmed, just enough to melt a single drop of dew from its surface. No one saw it. No one needed to. The story was alive. And this time, it didn't need to wait in silence. This time, it would walk with the world. Because it had learned, just as Layet and Mehi once had, that the greatest power wasn't in what we sealed away. It was in what we remembered with kindness. And now, across cities and sands, mountains and rivers, the flame inside this circle began to reappear. Not as a warning, but as a sign that even the oldest shadows, when held in the light of memory, could become part of the healing. And so the legacy continued. Softly, quietly, one dream at a time. The years that followed were quiet, but not empty. The land had changed, not on the surface, but deep within its memory. Villages began to keep small tokens of their stories again. Elders sang the old songs without shame. Children asked questions that no longer frightened their parents. People still worked the fields, gathered water, lived and aged as they always had. But now there was something else, a thread woven through ordinary days, something that connected them all, a sense that the past was no longer hiding in shadows or buried in forgotten tombs. It was walking beside them. In the heart of the city where it had all begun, the fig tree stood tall. By then it had grown thick and wide, casting shade over half the garden. Travelers often rested beneath its branches, drawn by a quiet peace they couldn't explain. Some left without ever asking its name. Others sat for hours, tracing the strange symbol carved into the old black stone that lay beneath it. The flame inside the circle. No one spoke of it loudly, but everyone who touched it felt something stir in them. Not fear, not power, just memory, gentle and patient. One day, a young woman came to the palace asking to see the archives. She wasn't a noble or a priestess or a scholar. She said she was a potter's daughter, but she carried with her a worn scrap of cloth that had survived years of fire and rain, and on it was drawn the eye symbol, rough and uneven, as though copied from an older, faded version. When she showed it to the scribes, they led her straight to the inner library without question. Inside, she found a small room no one had entered for generations. Dust lay thick across the floor, but the air felt light, like it had been waiting. On the far wall hung an unfinished mural. The colors had faded, but the shapes were still visible. At the center stood a woman with silver hair, her arms open, a circle of flame glowing at her chest. Around her, others stood in silence, some familiar, others forgotten. Together, they faced a horizon filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a different story. The young woman stared at the image, and though she didn't recognize the faces, she felt like they had always been a part of her. Later that evening, she walked to the fig tree. The garden was quiet, touched by the soft gold of the setting sun. She sat by the black stone and placed the cloth beside it. The wind shifted gently. A single leaf drifted down and landed on her knee. She smiled, not because she understood everything, but because she finally didn't need to. The story wasn't a puzzle to be solved. It was a river to float along, steady and deep. In time, her name too would become part of the memory. Not as a hero, not as a priestess, but as someone who chose to remember. And as long as people like her existed, quiet, curious, kind, the memory would keep flowing. New names would join old ones. New dreams would carry familiar echoes. And the presence behind the sealed door once feared and misunderstood, would continue its transformation. It no longer longed to be released. It simply wanted to be seen, held, known. There were still places across the land where echoes stirred. Old temples, buried passageways, mirrors forgotten in dusty corners. But none of them were dangerous anymore. They had become part of the world again. Balanced, accepted. They reminded people that history wasn't only made of victories and monuments. It was also made of silence, pain, and the bravery of those who chose not to turn away. The final record of Mehi's life was carved on a flat stone hidden inside a wall behind the inner temple. It simply said she listened. No dates, no titles, just that. Because sometimes the greatest gift we can offer the world is to listen to what it tried to bury and choose to carry it with care. Layet's name, too, lived on, though never shouted. Her pendant was eventually found in a sealed box tucked beneath the altar, alongside a bundle of folded linen marked with the eye symbol. It was displayed only once, then quietly returned to rest. People understood now that it wasn't meant to be a relic. It was a reminder. As the centuries passed, the world changed. Cities rose and fell. Rivers shifted course. Languages evolved. But the fig tree remained, rooted deep in soil that remembered. And every once in a while, someone passing through would find themselves drawn to its shade. They'd sit quietly, run their fingers along the smooth surface of the black stone, and feel something stir in their chest. A story, a name, a memory of something they hadn't lived, but somehow still carried. And they'd walk away feeling just a little different. Not enlightened, not burdened, just connected, as if the silence between their thoughts had filled with something warm and ancient. That was the gift of the story. It never needed to be finished. It only needed to be passed on, not as history, but as a part of us. Because in the end, the greatest truth of the disturbing life of pharaohs and the people who lived in their shadows was that memory itself was sacred. The darkness, the mystery, the whispers, they were all part of a long conversation between the past and the present. And as long as someone remembered kindly, the past would never be lost. Only waiting, only listening, until we were ready to hear it again.